Today we are creating this amazing animated Rubik's Cube page. We have this amazing animated Rubik Cube in the middle of our page, as well as some information text at the left and at the right. We also have a heading for our page, a logo, and this animatable nav bar. We have those icons at the left bottom. We can also click on a nav link and this will get us to the desired section. Here we have our icon section that includes everything the company is basically doing. If we keep scrolling down, we get to our team section and we have this cool animated image hover effect right here, where the image basically scales once we hover. If we go further down, we have our contact form where you can enter a name, an email, a topic, as well as a message, and send this message by clicking on the send message button. At the bottom of the page, we have the footer, which includes some links to maybe teams, jobs, sponsors, and so on. We will create all of this only using HTML and CSS. So let's get started, guys. So the GitHub link for the images and the entire project will be in the description. So if you want to use the exact same images, feel free to go and click on the GitHub link in the description and download the images folder. First of all, we are going to create our index.html file as well as our style.css file, because those are the files that we are going to need. Inside of the index.html, we are going to generate a basic template, and we can give our website a title like Rubik Cubes, for example. Now, first of all, let's define the basic structure of our website by using a header, as well as a main container and a footer. Inside of our header, we are going to have a div that wraps two other divs. The first div contains the text for the logo, and the second div contains our navigation bar. And inside of this nav bar, we have an anchor tag, and the first anchor tag obviously goes back to our home page, so to our initial page, and it says home. Now we can create multiple other anchor tags, and the second anchor tag can say our mission, for example. The third one can say team, and the fourth one could say contact, for example. So this is the structure of our navigation bar. I'm also going to open our index.html with the live server so we can see it. And this is what our website looks like. So let's start styling our website. First of all, let's link our style sheet by using link:/CSS and linking our style.css file. Instead of our CSS file, let's first use the universal selector to give our document a margin of 0 pixels, a padding of 0 pixels, and box sizing of border box. Now let's also target our header, and let's give our header this background color. Feel free to just copy this background color. I really experimented a lot and tried to find one that looks pretty good. So feel free to just copy those colors and go ahead. Now we will also use a width of 100% and a height of 100% of the viewport height. So we're basically using the entire viewport. And we have this result. Obviously this here looks pretty terrible, so we're going to change that one next. So let's go ahead and create a class that says white, and we'll give that class the color of white. Next up, we're going to create a class that says font-XL, and that class has a font size of 40 pixels. And let's create a class that says .bold, which creates a font weight of bold. And now let's use those classes to style our logo. So we are going to give that class the class white to create white text, bold to create bold text, as well as font-XL to create a larger font. And now we have this result. Also, let's start to incorporate a different font by going to Google Fonts Roboto, and we're going to get Roboto for this project. So we're going to the website, we're going to click get font to get the font, get embedded code. Now we have to embed those links inside of our header in the index.html file to use this font in our project. And now we can use the font by using font family Roboto inside of our style sheet, and we are going to use it inside of our entire body. So we'll define it here. And this is the result of the font we are using right now. So let's also go ahead and style our navigation links by using the class .white as well as ._none, because right now our text is underlined and we definitely don't want any kind of form of text decoration. So we're going to use text decoration none to get rid of the underline. And now we're going to give our anchor text the class of _none as well as white. So we have white anchor text like this. So let's just go ahead and copy those classes and give those classes to our second and third and fourth anchor tag as well. And this is what the website now looks like. Next up, let's create a class to use a flexbox for those containers. So basically I want to have one of those classes at the left, right here, and I want to have the navbar at the right here. So we're going to create a flexbox to create a separation. So we use .flex to create display of flex, and we're going to use or create a class that has the name justify between to create justify content space between, like so. And now we can go here and say, let's give this div the class of flex and justify between. And now we're going to save the document and we have this result. So all of our tags are right here, or our nav links, and our logo is at the left. Let's also use or create the class items minus center to align items center. We're going to copy this class and we give our navbar the item center class as well. And now we have this result, which is a lot better already. So now let's also give our anchor tags some form of padding. So we can create a padding to the left, so on the x-axis, and to the right, and to the top and to the bottom, so on the y-axis. So let's, for example, say we want to have .py of, for example, 1, which says padding top of 10 pixels and padding bottom of 10 pixels. And we're going to do the same for the x-axis by saying .px minus 2, for example. So let's say padding left 20 pixels, padding right 20 pixels. And now let's use px2 and px1 for this nav leg, and py1, so py1, px2, and we're going to save the document. And now we have this padding basically. And now let's use those classes for the other links as well to get some more padding. And you'll see why we are using padding instead of a gap in a second. And now we basically have this contact form. Now I also want to have some padding to the top and bottom and left and right for the entire top bar, if you want to say so. So let's go ahead and say, okay, let's generate py of 4, for example. I just want to take a look at the style and how it looks once we apply it. So let's use py4. Maybe this is a little bit too much, but we'll see in a second. And I want to have py of 4 for the entire top bar. And now we have a little bit of space, but actually this is probably a little bit too much. So I'm going to go with py2 and let's say 20 pixels top bottom, 20 pixels bottom, like so. And now we use py2 and this looks a lot better already. Let's use px4 though, and I think this could look pretty good. So let's go right here and replace 20 pixels with 40 pixels. And we are going to use px of 4. And now this is what our navbar looks like. And I think this looks pretty cool already. Now there's another thing that we can do. And the first thing I want to do is basically give the active class, so basically our index.html, with the href of index.html background. And we can do so by using nav a brackets, and inside of the brackets href equals index.html. So we're going to target every nav link inside of an anchor, every anchor inside of a nav link that has the attribute href equals index.html. So that's basically our homepage, and we give this one a background of white and a border radius of maybe 30 pixels and a color of black. So we have black text on a white background, and this is what it looks like. And as you can see, it looks pretty cool already. But let's also say that once we hover over a nav link, so nav a : hover, we get the exact same style. So now it looks like this. But as you can see, we have actually no gap at all between our items. The padding makes our buttons look pretty good, but it doesn't make the space between our buttons look good. So we can also maybe say .gap -2, and this one gives a gap of 20 pixels. So let's go inside of our navbar and let's say we use the classes of flex to enable gap, and let's use gap -2 to create a gap. And now we have this gap between the items, and I think this looks pretty good. So this is what our navbar looks like for the moment, and I think this is fine. So we are going to go to the next step, which is creating our Rubik Cube with some text at the left and some text at the right. So let's go ahead and do that one. First of all, obviously we can also use a comment to say that this is our nav bar, and now we copy this comment and we go below our nav bar and say that this one here is our cube, and we are going to create another div, and inside of this div we have another div that is basically the placeholder for our text. So we can, for example, say, okay, let's have an h2 here that says we are making the best cubes, and a paragraph that has maybe 30 words, like so. Now between this div and the exact same div for now, since we keep this as a placeholder, we want to have a cube, and I show you what this looks like. So we're going to use an div, and inside of this div we keep an image, and this image is pointing to our images folder and to our cube.png. And this might look terrible for now, but we're going to style this later on. But as you can see, we have a div on the top, a cube in the center, and another div at the bottom. So the first thing I want to do is create a grid. And we are going to use a grid instead of a flexbox because this makes it slightly more responsive, but it doesn't really matter too much. But yeah, for now we are going to create .grid as a class and set display to grid. Now the next thing we are going to do is .grid auto, or create a class .grid auto, which will have grid template columns. Repeat, because we want to repeat the columns a certain amount of times. We are going to use autofit to create as many columns as necessary, and we create min max to define a min and a max value of 250 pixels and 1 fr. So if space is available, take up one fraction of the available space. Once you get to 250 pixels, just wrap the items into the next row, which makes this grid extremely responsive. And we will use this class a couple of times during this project, so this one is really important. So let's go inside of our div, our container div, and say we want to have a class of grid auto. And now we should have those items spaced next to each other. Now I also want to create another class that says .grid minus center, and we're going to use place minus items, and we use center to center our items. So now let's first of all target our cube by creating .cube as a class, and we say we want to have a width of maybe 500 pixels. So let's go to our Rubik Cube, or to be precise to our image, and let's say class equals cube, which is the class we've created right here, and by doing so we set the width to 500 pixels. Maybe we should go with 300 pixels, and now we see that this basically affects our cube. Maybe 400 is slightly better, and yeah, maybe 300 was better. So we're going to go with 300 pixels. So now let's also center align our items by using grid center, which places our items inside of the center of the grid, and we give our grid the class grid center, and now all of our items are centered. Basically it still doesn't look too good, so the next thing we are going to do is basically make sure that our entire container just takes up 80% of the available space, because I don't want the text to be so close to the left and to the right. And we can do so by creating another class that says .w minus 80, and we'll say we want to have a width of 80% right here. And now we are going to go to our grid and say w minus 80 to create a grid that just takes up 80% of the space. But now we also need to center it. And we can do so by creating another wrapper container around our grid and say that this wrapper container has a class of flex and justify minus center. We don't have justify center yet as far as I know, so we're going to create that class right between justify between, and we say dot justify minus center, and we create justify content of center, and this should center our items, as you can see. So the next thing we want to do, maybe we should also center align our items, so we're going to use item center as well, just to make sure that they are centered by doing so. And now we also want to have white text, and maybe want to have some spacing between this paragraph and this heading. So first of all, we can obviously go into our grid and say that we want to use white for the exact entire container, and now our entire container is basically white. Maybe we should also add some margin to the top, so we probably have to create this class by using dot mt1, for example, and let's say we want to have a margin top of 10 pixels. And now we use this mt1 class for our paragraphs, and I'm going to copy the exact same class and give this to our second paragraph as well. And now we have some margin basically right here. And maybe this text is aligned perfectly fine, but this text should maybe be aligned to the right, for example. So it should go from right to left. And we can do so by creating classes. Let's create the class text minus center, which uses text aligned to center. Let's also create dot text right to text aligned to the right, because we will probably need text center later on, so I'm going to create it right now. So let's go to our first div probably and say that we want to use the class text minus right. And now our text should be aligned to the right, as you can see. And this works perfectly fine. Now, another thing that we should add is probably an animation to our Rubik Cube, because like this, it looks pretty boring. So I think animating that one would be pretty cool. So we give our cube class basically an animation. And we can do so by, first of all, obviously creating our animation by using keyframes identifier. Let's use the class float. And let's create an animation from 0% to 25%, to 50%, to 75%, to 100%. And obviously, first of all, let's start by using transform of translate of maybe 0 pixels and rotate of maybe, let's use 0 degrees. Doesn't really matter though. And we're obviously going to use the same transform property for the last keyframe, because it should basically end where it starts. So now for 25%, we can, for example, say, okay, translate 20 pixels on the y-axis. So we're going to use translate y right here. And let's say we want to rotate by maybe 7 degrees. Now we copy this one and we say we want to translate to -4. Now we want to translate to 3 degrees, for example. And right here we are saying we're going up. Now we're maybe going down to -10 pixels. Now we're going up to 20 again. Or let's say we're going down to -30. Now we're going up to 10. And now we have this rotation. And now we're going to use this animation. We'll see how it looks. We can obviously adjust it later on. But for now, let's just test this animation by using animation float. We want a time of maybe 20 seconds, ease in out. And we want to use infinite, so it loops forever. And now let's take a look at our cube. And this is what our cube now looks like. It's basically rotating. Now it's going upwards once again. It's obviously also rotating when it goes upwards. Now it goes downwards again, and so on. And this will basically loop forever and ever and ever. And if you want to create more complex animations, you can obviously do so. You can be creative there. But this would obviously take a lot of testing and a lot of trial and error. And for the purpose of this tutorial, I think you definitely know how this works and how this can look like. So yeah, let's go ahead and keep adding a heading, an H1 to our website that basically tells the viewer immediately what the website is about. So let's go ahead and right above our cube, I want to have an H1 that says best Rubik cubes you get, or Rubik cubes 2K25, which would probably look pretty cool. And now we obviously need to use a class that says that this is white. Text minus center can be used here as well. So now our text is centered. Let's create a much bigger text though by creating another font class, which is probably font minus XXL. We use 80 pixels right here, and we use font minus XXL for our H1. And now we have this heading. Now maybe it's also pretty cool to have some margin top, some margin bottom. So I'm going to create a class that says my.my. We have mt. So we are not having margin on the y-axis yet, but we can do or create one by using my -8, margin top 80 pixels, margin bottom 80 pixels. And now let's use this class of my 8 for our heading, so we get some margin on the top and some margin on the bottom. And this here looks really, really good to me, to be fair. So now the last thing we basically need are those icons at the left bottom. And we can add an icon section, so we're going to use this comment once again, and we'll paste it down here and say that those are probably our socials. And we create another container to wrap our socials. Inside of this container we have an anchor tag, and inside of this anchor tag we want to use an image. That image goes to our images folder and uses the Instagram SVG. Now we are going to copy this anchor tag, we paste it twice more, and now we can remove image/Instagram and replace it with image with youtube.svg and discord.svg. And now we would have those large icons. Obviously, if you have them as an SVG, I really recommend to incorporate them as an SVG into your code. By just going into the images folder, you could obviously go to the SVG, click open with text editor and copy this code, paste it in here, and you would have the exact same result. But the reason I'm not doing this is because I want to keep the code as short and as clean as possible for you to understand. But obviously for performance purposes, this would be the better way to go. So let's go ahead and give our images the class of socials minus icon. And I'm going to create a style for this socials minus icon class, socials minus icon. I'll give it a filter that has a brightness of 0 and invert of 1, because right now our icons are basically black, and if I invert the color and set the brightness to 0, so brightness 0 basically sets the color to black, and inverts the color from black to white, from white to black. So this one is basically what turns our icons white, and this is what I'm actually going to need for the purpose of this project. And now let's also use a width for our icons of maybe 30 pixels by doing so. And now we have those icons, and I think this looks pretty cool. So the next thing I'm going to do is create some style for a social container or socials container, which we haven't used yet, but we are going to use this class and give it to the wrapper div. So the wrapper div has the class socials container, and we use a position of absolute, but we obviously need to define the element that is basically the container that has position of relative. So we need to define the container our element can position absolute to, or can use position absolute to. And now we basically have this header, so basically the entire page, 100% of the width. And this is the position relative element, and now we are using position absolute to position our social icons relative to our header, if you want to say so, by using position absolute. And we say we want to have a bottom of 0, a left of 0, which will push our icons bottom and left to 0. And now let's give them 10 pixels of margin to the bottom, for example, and 10 pixels of margin to the left, if you want to say so. And maybe you can experiment with those values. Maybe 20 would look a little bit better, because the icons would have some more space to breathe. I also want to have opacity of maybe 0.6 for those icons and see how this looks. And as you can see, this looks pretty cool. You could also use 0.4, whatever, you can experiment there. And now let's also use the class flex and maybe gap 2 for those icons, which might be a little bit too much. So I'm going to create another class that is .gap1, for example, which has a gap of 10 pixels. And now I'm going to use gap1 for the icons to have proper spacing. And this is what it looks like. Obviously you can use different gaps and whatsoever and experiment, but this is how you would create this cool animated logo cube page in HTML and CSS. So let's keep going by creating our mission section, and the first thing we are going to do is go into our main section, and inside of this main section we create another section, and we'll also use a comment to tell us what a section is about, and this is basically our mission section. Inside of this section we are going to create a div, and inside of this div we probably have an icon that redirects or that targets the Rubik.png, for example, but this doesn't really matter too much. We are again going to use an H3 and we say our cubes, whatever, and we have a placeholder paragraph of 30 words again, for example. And this is what this basically looks like right now. So we have this giant icon, we have this heading, and we have this text. Obviously, maybe this entire section should get its own H2 again, so basically a heading, and here we can say our mission, for example, and now we have this heading, which is obviously not big enough, so we can use a class of maybe text center and font XL. And now we have this paragraph. Now let's create some padding that we can use for every single section. So we are going to create .py of probably .py of my padding top of 80 pixels and padding bottom of 80 pixels. And now we're going to use py for our container, or for our section to be precise. This was my bad. So our section will have a padding y of 80 pixels and we will use py8. And now this looks like this, but it doesn't really change anything. Maybe we didn't py-8. Obviously we need the 8 right here, and now this should work. So now we have padding top and padding bottom, and this gives our content some space to breathe. So let's go ahead and style one of those containers. First of all, one of the container or the entire container can, for example, get a flex box, and now we also need to have flex direction of column, for example. So we're going to create flex minus column as a class, and we say we want a flex direction of column for this class, because right now the items are aligned horizontally, but I want to have them or keep them aligned vertically. So I'm going to create flex column right here, and now the items are still aligned vertically, but we can, obviously this is like looking terrible, but now we can align them in the center by using items minus center, and our items should be centered, and this is what we basically want. Now let's start to target our icon, so our mission icon, if you want to say so. Let's go and say class mission minus icon. We are going to use this class to target our icon by going to the bottom of our style sheet, and we'll say dot mission icon. We want to actually have a width of maybe 50 pixels. We see how this looks. So now we have this icon. I think 50 pixels looks kind of alright. And let's also create another font style, because I think font XL might be a little bit too much. So we're going to create font medium that has a font size of 20 pixels. So let's go to our H3 and give it a font minus medium class. So we have a font of 20 pixels, and this looks pretty cool as well. And now let's see what kind of margins we already have. .m, we have mt1, so let's create m.mt2, for example, margin top 20 pixels, and let's go ahead and create mt3 in case we want to use it later on, of 30 pixels. So let's go to our H3 and say we want to have a margin top of 2, so 20 pixels, and this is what it looks like. But maybe we actually even need margin top of 4, to be honest, because I think some more space would look a little bit better. So we go with mt4, 4, whoops, like so. And now we have this effect, and I think this looks pretty cool. But obviously, yeah, it doesn't really look cool because we need a grid for this entire section. So now we have one of those items. So let's create a grid and put 4 of those items inside of this grid. So let's go ahead and say, okay, we have one of those cards right here, card. I'm going to create a comment to separate the cards. And now we have a second right here, third right here, and a fourth one right here. And now we have those 4 cards. So let's use a grid to separate them and align them horizontally by going ahead and saying, okay, let's use a class grid and grid minus auto. So again, we're saying minimum space 250 pixels. Once you get below the space, basically wrap into the next line. So now if we are resizing this window and making it smaller, once it gets too small, it will wrap into the next line, as you can see. So our website is basically responsive without any extra work, just by using grid. Obviously still doesn't look too good, so we can use a gap for our items, which we are going to do. I'm just going to take a look at the kind of gaps we have. Maybe gap -2 should be all right. Otherwise we just have to create another class that has probably a gap of 3, but I think 2 is kind of fine, yeah. And this text here is not centered, which we actually need to change by using class of maybe text minus center right here. So let's take a look. And yeah, as you can see, now our text is basically centered. So I'm going to use the exact same class, but maybe we should also use empty of 1 between our heading and our paragraph. I don't know if we have this class already, so I'm going to take a look, .empty. So we basically have empty1, but obviously the div is not the thing that needs it, but it's rather our paragraph that needs some padding or margin. And now we have this effect basically. And I think this looks pretty good. So we are going to use this class for every single paragraph. And after we've given this class to every single paragraph, we should also use text minus center on every single div element to center the text in there. And now, once we save, we have this effect. And already looks a little better. But I think this takes up a little bit too much space, so I'm going to create W-80 for our wrapper grid, like so. And now this grid takes up 80% of the available space, and you'll see how this looks like in a second. Right here, obviously we need to center this grid though. So we're going to use div, put our grid inside of this div, and this wrapper div is basically going to center our items by using flex justify center. And now we have this effect, and I think this looks a lot better. I would also like to add a margin top empty of, maybe we can try 40 pixels, but I think maybe 40 is just not enough, and I'm actually going to create a much bigger margin. And I go ahead and try empty -8, so 80 pixels of margin, and now it looks like this. And I think this looks pretty much all right. Now we can also obviously change the icons for our section. Instead of a Rubik Cube, we could, for example, say the second one takes the idea.png. Now the third one takes the group PNG, and the fourth one takes the eco PNG. And now we can obviously also change the text. So now I've also added some placeholder text basically that would fit to a Rubik's Cube page, and then it could basically look like this. So next up we have the team section, so we're going to generate that one next. So right below the section for our mission, we are going to create another comment that basically says team, and right here we are going to create a section for our team. We say this one has a class of team minus container, for example. Now I'm going to target this team minus container. And first of all, we are going to just copy the radial gradient in once again. So we have a background, but obviously we are not able to see this background yet because we don't have any content. So I'm again going to use py of 8. So we at least have some padding to the top and to the bottom. And now we can also see what this looks like. I'm also going to use the H2 that we've already used, and just going to copy and paste this one on top of our section. And maybe I'm also going to change the color to white, so we have this heading on top of our section, and this one obviously says our team instead of our mission. So now we have this heading. Now let's create different cards for the different team members, if you want to say so. So every image has a div container. Inside of this we're going to create an image, and this image points to a profile inside of our images folder. So now we have this image, and as you can see, it's way too big. So inside of this, I'm going to put another div around this div, and now below this div we have an h3 that basically says the name of the member. So this could, for example, be Mike Sonnenberger. And we have a paragraph that, for example, says CEO and founder, whatever, doesn't really matter too much. And this is what it looks like. But I want to have, or ideally our images are slightly smaller. So I'm going to give this one a class of profile. And now we're going to style our profile class. But I'm also going to use a class for the div that says profile minus container. And I'm going to show you why we need this profile container and why we need this profile, because we're going to create a cool effect together. So first of all, let's target our profile container and say this one has a width of maybe 300 pixels and aspect ratio of, let's for example say 3:4. So it's a little bit higher than its wide. And now we are going to target our .profile, and let's say our profile takes up 100% of the width of the container, so basically 300 pixels, and 100% of the available height of the container. And as you can see, it now looks like this. Maybe we are going to go with 250 pixels, like so. And we are going to use object fit of cover to get rid of the distortion when it comes to our image. I'm also going to use text center for the entire div to center our text, like so. And I'm going to use white because I obviously want to have the white text. I'm also using flex and items center as well as flex minus column. And now we have this effect. Obviously, it doesn't really look too good, but we can actually make it look a little bit better by using border radius of maybe 10 pixels. We're going to copy the same border radius to our container, which is pretty important. And now we have this effect. Let's give our text some margin to the top by using class mt1, for example. Now it has some room to breathe. And this is what our card can look like. Obviously, we also want to have a cool cover effect, which we're going to create right now. So once we hover over our profile container, we want to change our profile. And this one should get a transform property of scale of 1.1. And as you can see now, when we hover, whoops, obviously this one should have the hover class, or it will affect the profile always. But now, as you can see, we are basically increasing the size, but this is not what we are looking for. This doesn't really look too good. So what we're going to do instead, obviously we add a transition property of all 0.5 seconds and ease in, out, or ease. And now we basically have this transition effect. Whoops, we obviously need to add this one right here. And now we have this smooth transition, but this doesn't really look good. So what are we going to do? We are just going to add the class of overflow hidden to our container, which just means you have a width of 250 pixels and everything above is basically hidden. And now you get this cool zoom in effect on an image without having any scaling of the container around it. And obviously you can make this slightly bigger, slightly smaller, whatever you want. But I think this is a really cool effect. And I would also add a cursor of pointer because this looks a little more real in my opinion. But yeah, this is what it is. So now let's create several of those cards, several of those team members basically. And we again can separate them by using a comment member, for example. Now we're going to copy this member and put it inside of a div. And inside of this div, we have another div. And now we have 4 members inside of this div. And this first div will be used for a grid minus auto. And now we have this grid, and now let's also use W minus 80 and use a gap of 2, for example. So now this is what it looks like. Obviously, we also want to center our grid. So we're again using the same trick. We're going to create a container that is a flexbox and uses justify center to center our content. So now we have this effect. And now let's change some of the profiles by using profile 2, profile 3, profile 4, and now we have different people. And now we can obviously also again use a margin top, for example, for this container of, let's try 8 again, because we used 8 for the previous section. I think this looks pretty cool. So now let's also change text. We can, for example, say this is Theo, whatever, or yeah. Then we have Rashid Fast and Baker Snaker, whatever. And let's say, I think those texts down here are also a little bit too big. So I'm maybe going to create a new font size by using .fontsm. And now I give that class a font size of 15 pixels, and I'm going to test how this looks. Font -sm. So now this one should be slightly smaller, and it is slightly smaller. It doesn't really make too much of a difference, to be fair. But yeah, you can just experiment with those values if you wanted to. So yeah, we have those ones, and now we could say, okay, this one is probably programmer and founder. Then they obviously also need a sprinter and a long jumper for whatever reason. We have those roles, and this is the team, and this is our team section. So next up, we should go ahead and create our contact section. And we can again do so by creating a comment that tells us that this is the contact form, and we will start by creating another section. Inside of the section, we again use our py8 class, and we will then start to create a form. Or let's start by using a form. Inside of this form, we're going to use an h2, and this h2 could, for example, be the same that we've used right here, with the difference that we are not going to center it and that it does not have a font color of white. So now it looks like this, and I want to have contact right here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give this one the class of form-container, and I want this form container to take up 500 pixels of the available space for now. So we're going to go here, .form container with 500 pixels. Maybe let's give it a padding. Oops, that one is a mistake. Padding of 40 pixels. And now we should have this effect. I also would like to center our form container. So I'm going to use another div around this form container. And this div will again have class of flex, justify of center. And now we centered our contact form. So let's give our contact form also a box shadow of maybe 10 pixels. Let's use black. Black might be a little bit too strong, yeah. So we're going to use a different transparency for our black color, and maybe we can also use a stronger value like so. Let's go with 0.3, and let's use a border radius of 10 pixels to get some round borders. And this is what we have for now. So let's go ahead and use an input field of type text that says here's, for example, our name, ID is name, or this could be email, for example. Let's say this is the name. And then we add a placeholder that says name. Now we're going to create another input field that says type is email. This is the email, ID is email, placeholder is email. So the company can obviously message the user back. Now we need another input field of type text. That could be the topic, for example. And we also have a placeholder that says this is the topic, and at the bottom, we're going to use a text area so the user can enter a message. So we're going to use name of message, ID of message, placeholder of message. Oops, this one should be uppercase probably. And now we have this contact form, which looks absolutely terrible. So we're going to change that by targeting our .form container and the input fields inside of this form container. Let's say we have a width of 100%. Let's say we have a padding of 15 pixels, a border radius of 15 pixels, a border of 0, an outline of 0. Let's use the exact same box shadow, but maybe let's just use 10 pixels for the blur. And let's take a look at our form. Maybe we need some rounded borders right here, so we're going with 30 pixels, and now we have this effect, and I think the shadow might be a little bit too strong, so I'm going with 0.2 and maybe 7 pixels for the blur. But yeah, this looks kind of right. Obviously you can change this according to your needs, and inside of this form we will probably also go ahead and use flex. We use just flex column, and we use a gap of maybe 2, but I think 2 is too much, so we're going to go with 1. And now we have this effect. Obviously still doesn't look perfect, and I'm also going to give our input field, the one at the top, a margin of top of 4 maybe, so we have a gap to our heading like so. And I think this shadow is also like a little bit too strong. I'm going to go with 10 pixels, but I'm going to use 0.1 instead. And now we have this effect, and I think this looks a little bit better. Also for our text area, I'm going to use almost the exact same styles. So I'm going to go here and use text area, but I need a different height. Maybe I'm going to use a height of 200 pixels, and now we have this text area where we can basically write a message. And I think this looks pretty much alright already. So the next thing I am going to create is create a button down here. And maybe we can also use some more padding, maybe 80 pixels. We can just try it. Doesn't really look better. So let's try 60. 60 is kind of right, I think. So yeah, let's start to create a button. So I'm again going to separate the body from the texture. So our body or button's body should generally have a padding of maybe 10 pixels top bottom, 40 pixels left right, border radius of 30 pixels, and maybe this should actually already be it. And now I'm also going to create button minus black, which will define a black color. So if we don't want a black color later on, we don't have to change the entire button class. We just have to create another class that says button green, for example, and can change or exchange our button black with the class button green. So body would still be the same, just the color would be different. And this makes it a lot easier to change things later on. So let's go ahead and say we have a color of black and a background of black, or the color should be white, obviously. So whoops, not white, like so. And now we're going to create this button by using button : submit. This button says send message, for example. Now we're also going to use the class of button black minus button. I don't know if this is right, I hope so. Button black would actually be correct. And now we also need to change one thing for the button. We need to create the property white minus space and no wrap, because otherwise the text would probably wrap. And I want to use a width of content or fit content, like so. And now we have this button. A cursor of pointer would make sense as well. And now we have this button effect at the bottom. Let's create border of 0. Because it looked kind of weird, and maybe let's use 15 pixels for padding on the y-axis. And now we have this button, and I think this button looks pretty cool, and this content form overall looks kind of alright. So there's probably only one more thing that we are going to need, which is the footer of our website. And we can create this footer inside of our footer section. Obviously we will have another div. Inside of this div we will probably have a couple of anchor text, and we're just going to use some placeholder text like about us. Maybe they also have our mission, maybe they have a teams section, maybe they have jobs they want to show, and maybe they have some sponsors. So those are the things they're probably displaying on their page. Obviously it would make sense to have a footer background color, so we're going to target our footer. Let's say we have a padding top 40 pixels, padding bottom 40 pixels. Let's say background is RGB 26, 26 and 26, so some form of gray or dark gray. And once we're going to save the page, it basically looks like this. So the next thing I want to do is basically create the class white and underline none for our anchor text once again. And I'm going to copy this class to every single anchor tag, and now we have those white text buttons, if you want to say so. And we are also going to use flex justify center. By doing so, now we have them in the center, and let's also use a gap of 2. So now we have a gap between our icons or buttons, and this is how a footer could look like. Obviously this is a pretty minimalistic footer, you can do whatever you want to your footer, but I think this looks pretty cool, and this is our finished website. Let's also start to make it responsive by taking a look at the several breakpoints. So we can go to inspect. Obviously I'm going to go into the normal desktop view, and now we have our width and our height here at the top once I resize our window. We have it here. So we can see at which point our layout really starts to break. So we need to hide several things or change several things. And as I already mentioned, our grids are usually responsive by default, so those ones there should actually work pretty well, even without doing too much, as you can see. Maybe since I'm seeing that this here looks kind of close to those ones, maybe we should increase the gap a little bit, and we should decrease the gap between the icon and the heading, so we can start to do that. So we are basically going to our card section. We have a gap of 2, maybe we're going to use a gap of 4 first of all. So we have to create another gap. We can just copy gap 2, replace the 2 with a 4 and 20 pixels with 40 pixels. So now we have 40 pixels right here, and it should look a little bit better in my opinion once we save, and once we save this. And now we have a slightly bigger gap. Would also make sense to get the icon a little bit closer to the rest. It's this margin right here, and we are going to use margin top of 2, and now this looks a lot better already in my opinion. So we're going to replace MT4 with MT2 for all of those icons, and now it should look pretty good. It sticks together, and it in my opinion, it looks good on pretty much every single device, and you can definitely tell what belongs to which section. So next up, our team looks pretty good in my opinion already, so there's not really much we have to change. Our contact form should probably be adjusted at a certain point, and this point is like probably at around 600 pixels, where this here gets really narrow. So we're going to create a media query to change the width of our contact form. Add media screen and max width of 600 pixels. So everything below 600 pixels is basically being targeted, and we're going to target our contact form, but I don't even know what kind of class I use for that form, so we're going to go and take a look. We use the class form container. So let's take a look. Form container has a width of 500 pixels, so we just have to adjust the width to really create a responsive layout. And maybe once we are below 400 pixels, 600 pixels, we want to have a width of 400 pixels. And as you can see, now it gets a little bit smaller once we reach 600 pixels, and once we reach 500 pixels, we can, for example, create a second media query, and we could say that just take up 300 pixels right now. So as you can see, once we get below 500, it gets a lot narrower, but this here should be fine. Maybe below 400 pixels, we need to change something again. So let's go create another media query below 400 pixels. Let's go to 270 pixels width. And now, yeah, this should look pretty much all right. Actually, there don't really exist any devices below 350 pixels anymore, so this is not really something you need to optimize, but everything above can be optimized. Most of the devices nowadays have a lot more resolution, so it doesn't really matter too much. And most of the time on a phone, it will probably look like this or like this. Obviously, you could add some more breakpoints and it would probably look a little bit better. I also think this here is a little bit too narrow. Maybe we are going with 350 pixels, so it looks a little bit better on especially bigger devices. But yeah, this one definitely works. So this is our contact form on several devices, and it definitely seems to work. Let's also take a look at our footer. Does our footer look good on all devices? So up to this point, it definitely looks good. But I think once we get below 450, we should probably change the font size. So we're going to create a media query that targets our footer once we get maybe below 500, which makes it a lot easier because then we can just use this breakpoint. So we're going to target our footer and we'll say font minus size of 14 pixels, for example. So now this gets a lot smaller and maybe below 400. So let's target the anchor text, which is a little more precise. Maybe below 400, we should go with a font size of 12 pixels, for example. So now it, in my opinion, it looks good up to 350 pixels, and yeah, below that it's not really, it doesn't make too much sense to optimize for this. You could obviously also just change the flex direction after a certain point and align them vertically, which would make a lot of sense as well, but for this purpose I'm just going to keep it like this. So yeah, there's probably only one more thing that we need to optimize, which is this Rubik Cube section. And for this section, actually at a certain point, probably at the 1500 pixels, I'm just going to remove those two containers because I don't really need them, to be honest. They are not that important and they just break the entire layout. So I'm going to create another media query at 1500 pixels by doing so. And then I'm just going to create a class that says dot display minus none. And this class will have display of none once we are below 1500 pixels. So I'm going to use this one and I'll give this class to our containers that contain the text. So by doing so, and the second one will also have the class of display none. And as you can see, the containers completely disappear. Once we get above 1500 pixels, they reappear. Once we get below, they disappear. And by doing so, I think this page here looks pretty cool on pretty much every device. Obviously, we need to change the navigation bar in a couple of seconds, but I think this one looks really good up to a certain point. So first of all, we are probably going to change our navigation bar because it looks pretty bad. So we are going to, first of all, target our logo and say once we reach a certain width, which is probably anything below 800 pixels, I would say, or 800 still works. Let's go to 700. 700 seems to work, but anything below 700, I don't think that this still looks pretty good. So we're going to copy this line and we're going to paste it in. We'll add the breakpoint of 700 pixels and we're going to take a look at our logo, which should be right here and has the class of, it doesn't have any class. So I'm going to go here and say logo minus container, and below 700 pixels, I just want to remove the logo container from the page. So now we just have this contact form. And once we reach anything below 700 pixels, I also want to center align our navigation bar. So what I can do is I can use a ID for this one and say this is my nav bar. And now I'm going to target our nav bar once we reach 700 pixels by using hashtag navbar, and I'm just going to say justify content center. And maybe I should use this ID for our nav container, and I'm also going to create a navbar minus container. So I'm also going to target this navbar container, and I'm going to say justify content center. And now I've basically centered this entire container, and inside of this container I've also centered the items, if you want to say so. And as you can see, now it still looks good up to a certain width, I would say, and this width is probably, yeah, I would say 500 pixels, and anything below 500 pixels, it's probably not perfect anymore. So we're going to use the breakpoint at 500 pixels, and we're going to use an ID to remove the hover effect and so on. So let's go ahead, use ID, and let's say this is anchor or link nav minus link 1, and let's just use the same ID. And I'm going to use ID selectors because they have a higher specificity and override the class selectors. So once we get to a certain width or below a certain width, we can target our links by using the ID selectors, and they will override the styles of the class selectors. And in our case, it was 500 pixels. So yeah, let's go to 500 pixels. Say we want to use navlink 3, navlink 2, navlink 1, and I don't know if we just have a regular navlink, navlink 1, navlink 2, navlink 3, and let's also add navlink 4. So now we also want to decrease the font size to 15 pixels and see how this basically looks like, but it doesn't really change too much. So we should probably change the padding to 0 for everything element, and we should also change the background to none, so we don't have a background anymore, but the color should obviously be white for every single element. So now we have this nav bar. As you can see, we still have the gap, but removed the padding that we just used to have a cool background. And obviously the background looks kind of cool on desktop, but for mobile, it's not really necessary and just takes up way too much space to really make it responsive, if you want to say so. And as you can see, now our navigation bar is fully responsive and looks pretty cool in my opinion on pretty much every single device. And as I said, anything below 350 does not really matter anymore, but up to this point it definitely looks great. So our navigation bar is responsive as well. So now we can change two more things. One is obviously this giant header, which is way too big, and the second thing would be the width of our Rubik Cube. So let's start by targeting our H1 tag. So let's say H1, or we don't really have H1, so we give our H1 tag an ID as well, which is page minus heading, for example. And let's take a look at which point this starts to look kind of terrible. So I would say it still looks good. First of all, we should maybe decrease the width of the entire box. So what we can actually do is we are going to use a div, and inside of this div we have our H1, and this div has probably a class W-80, and we are going to use another container. Around this container we say class flex justify center to center our div, and now we have this effect. So now it does not take up 80% of the 100% of the space, but rather jumps into the next line once it reaches 80%. But I think at probably 500 pixels, 550, it starts to look pretty bad. So I'm just going to use the breakpoint of 600 pixels to reduce the font size of our heading by using our page heading ID that we've just created. And let's say we want to have a font size of maybe 50 pixels. I think we had 80 before. So now it still looks good. It still looks good. And it still looks good up to, let's say 350. So maybe I'm going to create another breakpoint below 400 pixels for our heading. And let's say that we just want to use 40 pixels for this one. And now it should look fine on pretty much every single device, if you take a look at it. And this is great. So this is responsive as well. It looks perfect on every single device in my opinion. So let's go ahead and let's change the width of our Rubik Cube. So if our cube should have the class .cube if I'm right. So we have the class cube right here. And under normal circumstances, our cube takes up 300 pixels of the width, which is kind of right. But at a certain point, and I think this point is like at probably 400 pixels, 500 pixels, it starts to look pretty bad. So as you can see, still looks good, still looks good, still looks good. And at 400 pixels, it might, let's say at 500, we're going to reduce the size of the cube slightly. So let's go into our media query, 500 pixels, target.cube, say width 250 pixels. Let's take a look at it, and now it still looks pretty good. 400 pixels still looks good. But I would say, yeah, below 400 pixels, we can probably reduce the size once again to maybe a width of 200 pixels. And now this should still, yeah, look pretty good. I would also increase the margin top to maybe 100 pixels. So now it's probably centered, looks good, looks good, looks good, looks good. Yeah. And as you can see, I would say that this one now looks good on pretty much every single device, wherever you're going to use it, up to 350 pixels probably. If you go down and you're going to rescale this section, it looks great as well in my opinion. Same goes for our team section, still looks pretty good on every single device, and the same goes for our contact and our footer section. So the last thing I want to add with you is that you can basically click on this element and you are jumping to our mission section, for example. And we can do so by just using a fast trick, if you want to say so. We're going to our individual sections. The first section is obviously our mission section. So we use the section, we give this section an ID that says mission. Our second section is our team section. We give our section the ID of team. And our third section is our contact section. We give this section the ID of contact. And now we can easily jump to our sections by going to our navbar and saying, okay, we'll give this one an href of hashtag mission. Second one has a hashtag team. And the last one has hashtag contact. So this basically tells the browser jump to hashtag contact, so to the ID of contact. And once we click on contact, for example, or mission, we are jumping to mission, team, contact. And now let's also add some smooth scrolling behavior because this looks a lot better. So we're going to go into our universal selector, scroll behavior is going to be smooth. So now we have a smooth transition, as you can see. And now this page really looks pretty great in my opinion.